Hi, I'm Pamela Addy, and we're going to continue with week 10, chapter 6. This is called Define and Understand Markets. And this is another really complex component of our jobs. And I'm always surprised that it is really difficult for us to get imaging relevant market data. So without the data, that makes it really hard. So markets are really tricky, and it's difficult to truly predict whether we will be successful or not. So we need to know as much information about the market as we can possibly gather. So who is our market? So this primarily speaks to the group of people who are in need of our services. But as we know, that eventually almost every person will need our services. I mean, just think about that. How many people go through life without getting some imaging exam? So these are the roles involved, and this is pretty much common sense, so you can read this over. And because we provide, especially in imaging, we provide such a variety of types of services, you may need to break the market up into segments. So think about what you are marketing to determine your 3 levels of variables to identify your segments. You'll find that as we said before, no one understands the uniqueness of imaging or the imaging market better than we do. An example of the basic variables: appointments available in 1 to 2 days. Mid-level variable: most insurance is accepted. The third level would be something like the 3T MRI. And you really need to know your consumers. Are they looking for state-of-the-art equipment? Are they looking for easy access, easy parking, quick appointments? Are they looking for low cost? So if you have multiple imaging centers, your market may be different. Your consumers may be different in each subsection of your market. Just for an example, let's say your market is the greater Sacramento area. So your consumer who lives in Placer County, Roseville, Granite Bay, is going to be decidedly different than your consumer who lives in, let's say, Woodland or Modesto. So you really do need to understand exactly who your consumer is and what is important to them. And I say always be on the lookout for market research. Use any market research you can find. I've had great success with vendors being able to provide some of this data. I think in this day and age, again, with the competition, with the fact that we need to be really good stewards of our equipment, the vendors are looking for additional value that they can bring to us as we are their consumer. And that value may be providing us the market research we need. But be leery of just any market research, right? So it needs to be specific to either healthcare or imaging, which is, we've already talked about how challenging that is. It needs to be objective. It needs to be systematically performed and reported, useful, and decision-oriented. So it's got to be data that helps us make decisions. It needs to inform us to make decisions properly. And there's a difference in what they call primary research and secondary research. So primary research is new data specific to a project. We want to do something, we contract with somebody to provide us that research that we're looking for that project. Secondary research is research that's already done and is out there available for us to sometimes purchase, sometimes just collect. And so this is existing data that we could slice and dice how we need it. So slide 11 describes the advantages of primary research, but I want to warn you that we don't always have the luxury of being able to conduct primary research. It's costly and it takes a lot of time, especially for something so specific as imaging. And here you can see the disadvantages of primary research, like we just talked about, cost and time, probably the two largest components. Now, secondary research may be more readily available, but it may not be specific, and especially specific to imaging. So already, I think you're starting to see why it's so challenging to find imaging-specific research. And the disadvantages of secondary research. Number one, lack of specificity. So there you have it. So what do? Right? We don't have the time. We don't have the funding that we need to conduct really a large-scale primary research. So what do? Well, most of the time we just do informal research. So if you wanted to create some type of informal research, here are the 6 steps that you would go through. And I'm not going to read each of these slides. They're pretty self-explanatory and straightforward. So here's step 1. Obviously, identify the problem. So again, if you're marketing something specific, like the new 3D mammo machine or something that you just are getting ready to implement, or you want to see if there's enough demand for it, you would identify that specific problem, the demand for 3D mammography. Step 2, certainly to specify the information that you need. What information would you need to know about 3D mammography? Well, maybe the demographics of the region, maybe the number of referring physicians in that market space. And step 3, design your plan. So figure out what you want to do and then design a research plan around that. And that might just be, it might be researching your opinions of referring physicians. You know, do they see enough patients? Are there patients requesting the new 3D mammography? Are they requesting, do they have a need for the 3T MRI, that type of thing? And what does the plan design look like? Well, maybe it's a questionnaire for your referring physicians. Maybe it's a short questionnaire for your existing patients who are already, that you've already captured in terms of what other services they're looking for. And after you collect this information, obviously analyze the data and prepare a report to inform the decision makers. So profile the market segments. Now this is getting a little bit deeper than we may perform as imaging administrators, but the idea is that each segment requires a profile to understand their purchasing habits. Now, one of my favorite things is projecting market demand. This looks different for each modality. So identify the drivers of the demand and then project the utilization based on this data. Identify what drives 3D mammography. We were building a medical office building, and the leadership wanted to have imaging services in there, and the entire building was going to be pediatrics and OB, and they wanted to have plain x-ray. And I said, okay, the problem with that is that they are not the drivers of imaging, of general x-ray services. Now, if you build a building that has orthopedic surgeons in it, that's a driver of x-ray. If you build OBGYN, That's going to be more of a driver of ultrasound. Jury of executive opinion. So this is a fancy title for a multidisciplinary review, and I guess they're saying by leadership. For instance, when projecting outpatient imaging utilization, it's helpful to understand from the organization, from the others in the organization, if they may be acquiring new physicians that year. Like our last conversation, if we find out that they're bringing on new physicians, we need to know what type they are, right? If they're bringing on dermatologists, it's not going to, an allergist, it's not going to create a lot of imaging demand. But if they're bringing on orthopedists, or neurologists, neurosurgeons, then we know that's going to increase our demand. And we can identify which modalities it does. And if you can get really good at this with your financial analyst, you can set up some equations that you can really access every year. One orthopedist will refer in a year or a month or whatever it is, will refer X number of patients for X-ray, X number of patients for MRI, X number of patients for CT, not too many for ultrasound. And you can set up, equations like this and algorithms where you can have this information constantly. So market testing is a possibility. In imaging, it's probably more reasonable to test the market out for a type of procedure that's available on an existing piece of equipment. It's hard, our equipment is so expensive, it's hard to bring in, let's say, a 3T MRI and say we're going to test the market to see where else we're going to put it. We just don't have that ability. They're just too expensive to cite. But if it's a service on the MRI, that we could test out. I think an example of this could be breast MRI. Maybe in some of the smaller outlying areas, we might want to test, is there enough demand for breast MRI to be able to offer it at that facility? And there may not be. It may be that these patients already go down to the primary breast center, and that's where they're having their diagnostic, and that's where they're having their biopsies, so that's where they end up having their MRI. Now, I'm going to tell you, analyzing the competition. In reality, for imaging, we often analyze the competition through our employees' knowledge. Our employees typically know what's going on with the other competitors in our area. We have to keep our eyes and ears open, and this is typically how we find things out. So if you have this information available, these steps are very useful. And again, we have the old SWOT analysis. So I would, if you don't know what that is, I would learn what it is and how to go about creating one. And as usual, acquire the data, analyze it, and prepare a report. So sometimes getting market data is extremely challenging, and I've heard imaging managers, even directors say, well, how am I going to figure that out? But you have to figure out a way to figure it out. So we have to be creative. We have to use all the resources we can think of, and we really need to get as much of this information as possible so that we can meet our community's needs.